Hi, EDU 383. Welcome to week two. We're going to continue those two strands that I talked about in week one. One is looking at transition, and the other one is looking at job development because it's really employability that is the biggest sticking point for students with low incidence disabilities who are transitioning out of high schools and different programs into the workforce and into the community. So that's why we're looking at those two strands again. That first strand, as far as transition is concerned, I've left you a discussion board that I'd ask you to complete. It really has to do with self-determination. There are several different instruments and assessments for self-determination, which is defined as the ability for self-agency. So it's really being able to make choices on your own for yourself without any sort of coercion or control from anybody else. And of course, this is a difficult process for students who are differently able with low incidence disabilities to develop in some ways because they have a lot of related services and they have a lot of support staff. And everybody has a different idea about what's age appropriate for that particular person or where that particular person's strengths and abilities stand. So there's a lot of confusion around that. And as a result, self-determination is not always something that's on really a priority or on the high end of the radar for people who are working with students with low incidence disabilities in secondary programs. So for you, what I'd like you to do is to think about self-determination as really an important stepping stone to that person-centered planning, which is talked a little bit about this week, and we'll also talk a little bit more about in the coming weeks, ways to develop a plan, ways to develop a system of support around a person that includes their families, their caregivers, their teachers, and all those people who come in contact with them. That's also part of the discovery process that I had you read about last week, where you're looking at not just what a person's interests are and what their dreams and desires are for themselves, but also what lies below the surface. And chapter 3 talks about this in a little more detail, looking below the surface with a person and with a job to discover where there are some gaps and where there are some matches that a potential job seeker can fill at a small business, which are largely the kinds of opportunities that will provide employment for individuals with low incidence disabilities. So that's one strand. We're focused on self-determination. I've dropped in an assessment that I've asked you to take a look at, and then sort of summarize what you're able to observe as a result of working with your student for this week. There are other self-determination assessment instruments that I'll also include in a folder for week two. I'd like to have you take a look at those because those can be valuable for you as educators in secondary programs for special education in terms of designing self-determination opportunities for your students. So that's one strand, and that first step towards self-determination is something that we're going to look at. The second strand is represented by chapters 3 and 4 in your Job Developer's Handbook. Now, again, the Job Developer's Handbook is designed for professionals who are going into workplaces essentially to support people who are differently able or have low incidence disabilities. So this is a step beyond, in some ways, what you might be called upon to do and asked to do as special educators. It's important, though, because when you get into conversations about transition with caregivers and community personnel outside the school, or working with different support staff inside the school, being able to talk about your student in relation to particular jobs that they could learn themselves into. That's the real key, is you're designing jobs that students can learn and that they have the ability to learn with support and natural supports in the workplace. Being able to know what that process is like will help you, as well as the book says, you're also a transition specialist, and that person is on your caseload. So as a school-related provider, knowing about customized employment is very important. So let's take a look at chapter 3 first, which talks about a job analysis. And it really gives you all kinds of different scenarios, all kinds of different um, kind of strategies and characteristics of the job developer, of someone who's going in and creating a job or helping carve a job for an individual with low incidence disabilities in the community. Helping you to do that with from the perspective of starting from the ground up. So how do you enter a job workplace? What do you do? How do you present yourself? What are some of the questions that you ask? What's your attitude? What's your stance? What's your posture in relation to that place of employment? So you're going in to survey that place of employment, find out from the person in charge and the workers who are on the floor what that particular job is like and what their jobs are like, so that then you can situate your job seeker based on some potential gaps or some potential places at the firm that are not now being taken care of. So you're crafting a job, you're carving a job for for the person with whom you're working, who's transitioning into the workplace and the marketplace. So as a result, in chapter 3, we're focused specifically on the job analysis. So the job analysis comes in 3 particular frames. One is that job analysis description that's provided for you as a fairly lengthy document between pages 37 and 40 in your text. That's looking primarily and most importantly, I want to say, at the culture of the establishment. So the culture of the workplace. What are the relationships like? How true to the mission of the organization is the organization operating? What kinds of schedules are involved? What sorts of worker relationships, supervisor relationships are there? How does it feel, and what's the atmosphere on the job like? And would your student or the person you're representing be able to operate well and work well in that kind of environment, given their skill set and given the things that you know about them? So the culture of the company, the culture of the organization is very important to look at. And kind of looking around, observing, asking questions, things like, as your text points out, what's the potential for job advancement? How do workers transport to the workplace? What are the different relationships like, and what are the different groups like on the floor of the workplace? So answering some of those questions up front when you walk into an employer is very important. Then you're looking at the different tasks that the different workers at the firm do. So how many tasks are there? What are they like? What are the quality measures for those different tasks? In other words, how do you know when one of those tasks has been successfully completed? What are some of the tools? What's the level of accuracy and the speed with which the jobs have to be taken care of? Clearly very important for someone with low incidence disabilities who may have different processing speeds, different memory speeds that might be important to note in that workforce and in that particular firm. What kinds of supports are natural in the firm? So one of the things that this particular perspective on customized employment wants to get away from is the idea of having job coaches on whom that job seeker depends. What you're looking for is, what are some of the natural supports that exist within that firm and within that opportunity that are going to help your job seeker perform those tasks well? And are those levels of support available, and natural levels of support available? So supervisor support, immediate supervisor support, support from different peers and different workers at the firm. How long does the task usually take? Endurance can often be an issue for students with low incidence disabilities. So you want to know if there are breaks or how long, what's the duration of that particular job, and how long is it going to take to create into a final quality product or process. And last of all, what's the learning like at the job? So this idea of acquisition, learning, and again, you're matching that learning to what your student, what your person is capable of learning. The third piece involved goes back to culture, but it really focuses on quality of fit. So on pages 41, 42, there are a list of different questions that you want to answer. There's also some discussion of why these questions are important for a job seeker or for your student. So these also go back to company culture, but they're much more specific in terms of how the firm is organized, what kinds of in-service training is provided, how do groups socialize and interact at the particular firm, so that you have a good perspective on what kind of job your student and your job seeker is going to be walking into. And that's essentially the gist of sort of looking at job matching. And ideally, had we had the time, you would go from place to place in the community. So in Phelps, in Dundee, in Penn Yan, and visit different places of employment to see what those opportunities are like. That could be a stretch, although one of the things that I have asked you to do is to go down to some of these communities, look around, ask some questions, find out what kinds of opportunities are available, and ask those questions on that inventory on pages 41, 42, if you get the opportunity to get a sense of what those jobs would be like and how those jobs could match your individual who's differently abled. You won't have to place the individuals in these different firms, but again, what I'm interested in doing is getting you to have as much practical experience with some of these ideas as possible, so that you can see how they work for when you get into a position as a special educator. You can begin the conversation, if the conversation hasn't already started, about these customized employment opportunities. The fourth chapter deals with person-centered planning, and the idea of self-determination fits nicely into that, although this chapter deals pretty specifically with how the person can get planned into a job opportunity at a firm in the communities that they represent. So really what we're talking about in chapter 4 is, how do you make yourself known and how do you interact and network with the business community? This is something that at the very least in your community inventory, you've got an idea of what kinds of businesses are represented in the town and where there are some potential links to your person who's differently abled. Beyond that, the potential is there to also recognize at least or become a part of different business networking opportunities and groups that have been set up around different businesses. One of the best places probably to start that process is to ask some questions of Amy Cooper as far as Mosaic is concerned, and also having the opportunity potentially to talk to some people at Mosaic about how they represent themselves for job seekers to the community. So you're trying to find those jobs, you're trying to find those parts in those jobs that might work for your student. A lot of the focus in chapter 4 is on this idea of sales. And what you're doing is not only looking at these different business opportunities, but you're also in the process of selling your job seeker, your student, as someone who could potentially fill some of those gaps at the firm, or be able to have a carve out that they could be part of with support from different financial resources of the sort we talked about a little bit in class on Friday. So that's why that discussion of sales and the sales that the kinds of characteristics and the skills of selling have to do too with that community inventory, as well as making and developing the connection with the employer. So what are some questions that you ask? There's that posture, that stance of walking into a place of employment, not so much to sell your client, but to be inquisitive and curious about the work, what's done, what are the jobs that are here, what kinds of things go on, what's the pay? Asking those kinds of questions up front, again, with the idea in mind that you could potentially be selling your client into this job opportunity, and having some idea of what's there in the job and getting a good sense of the culture. You're asking those questions about, well, what's here? What do you do? What are the different jobs? What are the hours? So that you're developing a clearer sense of what's available at that particular business. So part of this is, trying it out. And part of it is stopping off in a place like Dundee or driving out to Phelps and kind of seeing what's available. You've got some good idea of some of the skill sets that some of your students and the interests and what they can learn. So what's down below the surface in your students that they might be able to translate or transfer into a job opportunity. So I'm going to encourage you to think about some of these ideas, try them out. If you're out and about in the community when you go, stop in and start asking some questions and try to find out if there's a job match, if there's a good analysis that you can create, and if there's a way to plan your person into a job that might be available. Thanks very much, and I'll be talking to you next week, and I'll see you in class on Friday. I appreciate your attention. Take care. Bye-bye.